Good afternoon. Welcome to the August 15th update on the tropics here. As always, these thoughts are mine alone, and in making decisions regarding each of our systems, please refer to the National Hurricane Center and your local weather office and your local authorities for all the latest information pertaining to you. Well, we're inching closer to the peak period, and we still have Fred here to deal with. We also now have Invest 96L here that is spinning away in the subtropical Atlantic. We do have Grace here that has failed to really organize here. We're going to talk about that last. Don't really have much to talk about with 96L. It's just probably going to develop and meander around in this general region here and then eventually turn to the north as it gets picked up by a trough. But first, we're going to talk about Fred. Here we are. Our system has managed to develop a consolidated low-level circulation and has been redesignated. The Hurricane Hunter aircraft this morning found tropical storm force winds in the northeastern quadrant of the system, and you can tell even on visible imagery that we have a rather lopsided system this morning. We do have an attempt at some symmetry here. We do have convection trying to build in the northwestern side, but it is being impeded by dry air here that is being imparted upon the system. You can actually tell that the shear is coming generally out of the south here. You can see on some of these lower level cloud tops here that the winds are blowing generally out of the southeast, but some out of the south here. As you gain latitude here, you can actually see this southwesterly flow that is very weak now, but is still present, and that has, if we look at the water vapor imagery, imparted some of this less than moist air upon the system. So it's becoming a little difficult for the system to symmetrize somewhat, but we still have a overall somewhat favorable environment for continued organization and strengthening here. This is not going to strengthen rather quickly as the environment is not ideal due to the negative factors that I just mentioned, but it is still expected to organize somewhat and maybe be able to intensify into a strong tropical storm here. This is definitely going to be a significant weather event for Florida here. But again, as we mentioned yesterday, due to the westward shift in track, the Florida Peninsula is not expected to get as much in terms of impacts here, but the Florida Panhandle, rather, is expected to get most of the impacts. If we look at our NHC forecast for the system, you can see that they expect it to move to the northwest and gradually turn to the north, and it should be impacting the Florida Panhandle sometime Monday evening. If it goes a little east, then that's a sooner landfall. If it goes to the west here, then it's a little later of a landfall, but regardless, most of the impacts should be starting either late tonight or Monday morning here as the system comes northward. Really, since we do have a lopsided system, if we look at the true color loop here, you can see that we do have a pretty just lopsided system here that is going to be bringing a lot of rain generally off to the east of where the actual circulation center is, and this is very common of weak tropical storms in the northern Gulf of Mexico. This is typically what a early season tropical storm would look like, but since we have been dealing with a struggling system that has just now begun to reorganize, we're probably going to be dealing with this comma shape here. If we look at the GFS model here, you can see that they've actually trended a little bit higher in terms of intensity here. Remember yesterday we had a less organized system with a lot of moisture off to the east of the system. And now we have trended with a little bit more of a symmetrical system. Not a really powerful system here, but definitely a notable tropical storm here, now 995 according to the GFS. And so we generally would have more of a wind impact here than what was previously expected. So maybe 60-mile-per-hour winds with gusts closing in on hurricane force, but generally not something insane, not a hurricane, but definitely a strong tropical storm here. So nothing to be played with here. You do definitely need to be taking this seriously if you are on the Florida Panhandle and the coastline there, and if you're inside, even inland a little bit, because this is, the Florida Panhandle's geography is so thin here. So if we look at the storm surge graphic here, you can see that now they are expecting 2 to 4 feet of storm surge between Indian Pass and the Steinahachie River here. And you have general water rises expected along the eastern side of the track here and maybe a little bit west of the track. But overall, storm surge watches and soon-to-be warnings will be issued for the stretch of coast that we just mentioned here. But that is not the only threat. We also have rainfall here, and so we have a pretty big swath of the Florida Panhandle that is expected to get at least 4 inches of rain. This may be higher depending on if a band sets up over the Florida Panhandle here, but overall, the flash flooding threat is confined to this area. It may be outside of this area. You know, you have the 2-inch contour here that is expected to, you probably could have, you know, maybe a couple more inches than what is expected. So just generally expect flash flooding in this area. Remember, turn around, don't drown, and be able to check your weather radio and have some form of warning service for flash flooding, and just stay safe. That's all we got for Fred here. If we move to Grace here, this is a rather different situation here than Fred. Rather than being more intense than we expected, this is not been able to really strengthen too much. Instead, we just have a mid-level presence here that has really been the only thing that is of note. We had an ASCAP pass this morning that actually showed that the system's lower level circulation may not even exist. We have just generally southerly flow. You can see that under the cirrus here, and then turning off to the west here, and then, you know, coming out. So it's really just a sharp wave axis, and maybe we have some southwesterlies here, but nothing incredibly organized. And so the system has failed to intensify. We still don't have a whole lot of pressure falls in this system. It's still above 1,000 millibars in pressure, which indicates a weaker storm and a not very deep storm. And so as a result, it has stayed a little further to the south here, which is not what we expected. We remember yesterday we were thinking that it was either going to go north of Hispaniola or go over Hispaniola, and now it has stayed very far south, so it needs to really gain a lot of latitude if it wants to hit Hispaniola. But regardless of whether or not it hits Hispaniola, since we don't really have that organized of a circulation, it actually would not feel the effects of the island as much. And since the mid-level circulation is the only thing that's really present here, that would not feel the effects of the island. Fred's mid-level circulation got decoupled because of ongoing shear. This is not encountering a ton of shear, since it has remained to the south of the upper level trough that we were supposed to be dealing with right now, because this is still in a pretty favorable environment. We have outflow coming out of the north side and outflow coming out of the southern side here, but due to the fact that it has failed to organize, it likely will pass either to the south or over Hispaniola. This is very bad either way, now that it is seeing that it is increasingly likely that we're going to have a lot of rainfall go over Hispaniola. As always, there are mudslides associated with this in both the Dominican Republic and Haiti, but this is particularly bad timing given that Haiti just dealt with a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, and a lot of people have unfortunately died, and there's a lot of people missing still. And this is not really a great time for another natural disaster to hit the area, so this is probably not going to be a great outcome regardless of the strength of Grace, as this is going to be dropping a lot of rain over Hispaniola. But track implications indicate that this is probably not a great sign further west. I mean, we really haven't figured out a lot here, besides the fact that it is now south of where it was expected. Remember, the GFS had a solution yesterday that went north of Hispaniola and strengthened as a result. And now that it may go south of Hispaniola and it may go over Hispaniola, we may not see a strengthening system until it gets to the west of even Cuba. And so if we look at the GFS model here, we can see that we're going to first go to the mid-level flow here. And you can see that the mid-level flow, you can see that the mid-level presence of Grace circled here south of Hispaniola is generally to the south of Hispaniola, and we have mid-level flow that is moving actually out of the north and northeast here. So this would actually keep the system south, and there's not, if you look at the lower level flow, if we go to 60 hours here, which is around the same time that Grace is, you can see that the mid-level flow is actually or the mid-level circulation is actually misaligned here. I wouldn't take this as verbatim here. I don't think that this is going to actually separate as much. So just take the overall steering flow as the main point of this forecast. You can see that the steering flow is predominantly out of the west here. And so there's not really a whole lot forcing this to gain latitude in the time that this is moving near Hispaniola. So this may actually be able to slip south of Hispaniola, and that would pretty much take the land interaction out of the conversation here. And I mean, regardless of land interaction at this point, it really would not be able to feel negative effects of that land interaction due to the fact that it is disorganized and there's not really much to destroy. And this is very similar to, if we go back to the water vapor loop, very similar to Laura in the sense that it only had a mid-level presence as it was moving over the island of Hispaniola, and so it really did not take that much damage from the crossing of the mountains of Hispaniola, and actually was able to maintain itself and maybe strengthen just a little bit. But due to the fact that this may not even be passing over Hispaniola at this point, that is a distinct possibility. We may not even have to talk about this much longer. So if I change the GFS model to the upper dynamics and the upper level, the 200 millibar wind here, we can see why this is so crucial here now that we have a trough that is not really affecting the system. You instead have strong northerly flow coming, or southerly flow coming out of the system, indicating that we have a well-defined upper level outflow channel here that is coming out of the system here. But if we look at the general upper level flow that is ahead of the system, we go back a little bit here, the GFS is still pretty north of where the system actually is at this point. And you can see that there's generally lighter flow in this area that it is traversing. And this is what remains true here. You can see there's still a little bit of northeasterly flow coming out of this trough here, this upper level anticyclone and what was a developing trough. And it really remains rather favorable here as this comes off to the west, and we essentially begin to develop an upper level anticyclone over the system, and generally not a really unfavorable environment for the system at this point. And if we look at the 5-day track here for Grace, I'm going to reload this here. You can see that the National Hurricane Center is still moving this over Hispaniola here, but there is a very distinct possibility that it does go south or minimally interact with this island. And so as it advances over to the west, the GFS doesn't really have unfavorable conditions for the system, and anything that gets into the Gulf here, if there's any coherent circulation that gets into the Gulf, it's really hard to see it not strengthening. But again, this is still beyond 3 days. We still do have to solve the land interaction problem here and see how much land interaction happens and what eventually becomes of Grace. And so we still have a long time to figure this out. This is Friday here, and we're currently talking about Grace on Sunday here. So if you're on the North Gulf Coast or the Northwest Gulf Coast, especially on the Texas coast and Louisiana coast, you do need to be watching this as this makes its way towards the Gulf of Mexico. We still have a lot of time, but still be very wary. Maybe get your hurricane kits ready, because this could be coming towards your area in T-minus 5 days. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and stay safe as the tropics continue to pick up.